Imagine a land that was once part of an ancient supercontinent, drifting alone for millions of years, shaping creatures unlike anywhere else on Earth. A land where time itself carved red deserts, coral kingdoms, and deep green rainforests. Where the first footsteps came not from explorers or colonists, but from the world's oldest continuous culture, the Aboriginal peoples, who have lived in harmony with this land for more than 60,000 years. This is Australia, an island, a continent, a world apart. Its history is not simply the story of colonization or gold rushes or modern nationhood. It is a tale written across eons of geology, waves of migration, and centuries of struggle between tradition and transformation. From Dreamtime stories to convicts on ships, from the battles of Gallipoli to the birth of a multicultural nation, Australia's history is as vast and unpredictable as its landscape. And today, we're going to explore it all. Not in fragments, not in myths, but as a complete journey. Over the next 8 chapters, we'll trace Australia's story from the very origins of its land and people to the vibrant society it has become in the 21st century. Along the way, we'll uncover secrets of survival, clashes of cultures, waves of prosperity, and the forging of a unique national identity. So settle in. This is not just history. This is the epic saga of a continent, ancient, scarred, resilient, and extraordinary. This is the entire history of Australia explained. To understand Australia, we must begin long before written records, long before colonial ships arrived. We begin with the land itself, because in Australia, the land is not just geography. It is story, memory, and spirit. Australia broke away from the ancient supercontinent Gondwana about 50 million years ago, drifting northward into isolation. This separation created one of the most unique ecological laboratories on Earth. Marsupials like kangaroos, wombats, and koalas thrived here, while monotremes, such as the platypus and echidna, preserved traits that vanished elsewhere. When the first humans arrived, perhaps 65,000 years ago, they entered a continent already ancient, already alive with creatures found nowhere else. These first Australians, the Aboriginal peoples, carried with them knowledge, language, and a cosmology that connected them to the land in profound ways. They did not simply inhabit Australia, they became part of its cycles. Through oral traditions, songlines, and the Dreamtime, they described how ancestral beings shaped rivers, mountains, and skies. These stories were more than myths. They were maps, laws, and survival guides passed across generations with precision. The archaeological record tells us they were masterful navigators and innovators. Sites like Lake Mungo reveal evidence of early burials and sophisticated cultural practices dating back over 40,000 years. Stone tools, fish traps, and controlled use of fire show how Aboriginal societies adapted to environments ranging from tropical coasts to arid deserts. Fire stick farming, a technique of deliberate burning, helped regenerate landscapes, manage hunting grounds, and reduce catastrophic wildfires. And so, while Europe was still in the grip of the Ice Age, Aboriginal Australians had already built complex societies. They lived in hundreds of nations, each with its own language, laws, and territories. In some areas, semi-permanent dwellings were constructed. In others, mobility was the key to survival. What unified them was not political empire, but a spiritual connection to country, a concept that fused identity, ancestry, and land into a single essence. For tens of thousands of years, this way of life endured. Generations passed, climate shifted, seas rose and fell. When glaciers melted and sea levels rose around 10,000 years ago, Australia's coastline transformed. Tasmania became an island, severed from the mainland, and the Torres Strait Islands formed in the north. Yet still, Aboriginal societies adapted, creating distinct cultures that carried forward traditions while responding to new challenges. This continuity makes Aboriginal culture the oldest surviving culture on Earth. It is a legacy that challenges the Western notion of progress as constant change. For here was a civilization that endured, not by conquering nature, but by harmonizing with it. But Australia's story was not only Aboriginal. To the north, across waters separating the continent from Asia, other peoples began to interact with the land. For centuries before European arrival, the Yolngu people of Arnhem Land traded with Macassan fishermen from present-day Indonesia. They exchanged goods like sea cucumbers, shells, and iron tools. These encounters left traces in language, art, and genetics, showing that even before colonization, Australia was not entirely isolated. Yet the vast majority of the world remained unaware of this continent. While Aboriginal nations thrived in their own worlds, maps elsewhere left Australia blank. A mythical terra australis incognita, the unknown southern land. That would soon change. As empires expanded, explorers began to search the seas, and Australia's long isolation would be broken. The next chapter will bring us to this moment of encounter, when Dutch, French, and finally British explorers placed Australia onto the global map, setting the stage for immense transformation. The silence of the southern seas was broken not by the voices of Aboriginal songlines, but by the creak of wooden ships and the ambitions of distant empires. For millennia, Australia had stood apart, known only to its first peoples and a handful of northern traders. But in the 17th century, as European powers expanded across the globe, this unknown southern land was about to be revealed to the Western world. The Dutch arrivals. The first significant European encounters with Australia came not from the British, but from the Dutch. In 1606, Willem Janszoon, a captain for the Dutch East India Company, sailed the Duifken along the western coast of Cape York Peninsula. He mapped part of the Gulf of Carpentaria, believing he had reached part of New Guinea. What he found, however, was unlike the spice-rich islands of Southeast Asia. It was harsh, dry, and seemingly barren. Other Dutch navigators followed. Dirk Hartog landed on the western coast in 1616, leaving behind a pewter plate inscribed with his name, a silent marker of Europe, as first documented landfall on Australian soil. Over the next decades, explorers such as Abel Tasman charted coastlines of what he named Van Diemen Land, now Tasmania, and the continent's northern and western edges. But the Dutch saw little value. The arid deserts and lack of obvious wealth made Australia unappealing compared to the lucrative spice trade in the East Indies. They mapped it, called it New Holland, and moved on. The land for them was a curiosity, not a prize. Other explorers and the French glimpses. The 17th and 18th centuries brought other European eyes to the continent. The Portuguese may have sighted it earlier, though evidence remains contested. French expeditions in the 18th century, led by navigators like Louis-Antoine de Bougainville and later Nicolas Baudin, mapped parts of the coast. The French, like the Dutch, were interested in science, cartography, and exploration, not immediate colonization. Each encounter was brief, a scratch along the vast outline of Australia. No settlements, no lasting presence, just names etched on maps and reports sent back to Europe. Enter the British. The turning point came in 1770. James Cook, an ambitious British naval officer and explorer, set sail on the endeavour to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti, part of a grand scientific mission. But Cook had secret instructions as well, to search for and claim lands in the South Pacific for the British Crown. Sailing west, he reached the eastern coast of Australia, a coastline untouched by Dutch chart. On April 29, 1770, he landed at a place he named Botany Bay, after the richness of its plant life. Unlike the barren western shores, the east was green, fertile, and inviting. Cook's journals spoke of open grasslands, tall forests, and harbours capable of holding the largest ships in the world. From Botany Bay, Cook charted the coast northward, eventually claiming the entire eastern half of the continent for Britain under the name New South Wales. He was struck by the abundance of resources and the potential for settlement. He paid little heed to the Aboriginal peoples he encountered, recording observations but not recognizing their sovereignty or deep connection to the land. First, contact tensions. These meetings were often uneasy. The Aboriginal peoples were wary of these strangers, their floating wooden islands, and the strange animals they carried, sheep, pigs, and dogs. To the Europeans, the Aboriginal societies appeared alien, their languages and customs incomprehensible. Misunderstandings quickly arose. Cook's own landing party fired upon the Gweagal people near Botany Bay when tensions escalated. These small confrontations foreshadowed the immense clashes to come. Why Britain needed Australia. The timing of Cook's discovery was crucial. Britain was expanding its empire, but it faced new challenges. By the late 18th century, overcrowding in British prisons had become a serious issue. The loss of the American colonies after the Revolutionary War cut off Britain's ability to transport convicts overseas. A new solution was needed. Australia, vast and seemingly empty in European eyes, appeared to be the answer. In London, Cook's reports circulated among politicians and visionaries. Here was a land with fertile soil, forests, and deep harbours, ideal for a penal colony that could also serve as a strategic base in the Pacific. The Aboriginal presence was largely dismissed or ignored, considered insignificant compared to imperial needs. The stage is set by the 1780s. The decision was made. Britain would send ships, not just to explore, but to settle. The First Fleet would carry soldiers, sailors, officials, and most importantly, convicts, men and women torn from their homes, sentenced for crimes as minor as theft, to begin lives of exile in this distant land. Australia, once terra incognita, was now firmly within the sights of empire. Its ancient continuity would soon collide with the machinery of colonization. And so the next chapter of Australia's story begins, one of hardship, survival, and transformation. In Section 3, we will witness the First Fleet's arrival, the struggles of early settlement, and the profound disruption of Aboriginal societies as two worlds collided. On a cold January morning in 1788, the silence of Sydney Cove was broken by the thunder of anchors and the creak of wooden hulls. 11 ships, their sails weather-beaten from a journey of more than 8 months, glided into the bay. On board were over 1,400 souls, sailors, officers, marines, and convicts. This was the First Fleet, commanded by Captain Arthur Phillip, carrying with it the beginnings of a new society and the beginnings of a new chapter in Australia's history. The voyage and arrival. The First Fleet had departed Portsmouth in May 1787, bound for Botany Bay, the site James Cook had praised nearly 2 decades earlier. The fleet carried supplies, livestock, seeds, and tools, but most importantly, convicts sentenced to exile. These men and women, many guilty of petty crimes, were torn from Britain's overcrowded prisons. For them, the voyage was a passage into the unknown. After a grueling journey that took them via Tenerife, Rio de Janeiro, and Cape Town, the fleet finally reached Botany Bay in January 1788. But Philip quickly realized the bay was unsuitable. Its soil was poor, its water scarce, and its anchorage unsafe. Moving north, he found a more promising site, a sheltered cove with fresh water and fertile land. There, on January 26, 1788, he raised the Union Jack and claimed the land as the colony of New South Wales. This date would later become Australia's National Day. Though for Aboriginal peoples, it remains a day of mourning, invasion, and loss. The harsh reality of settlement. The first years were brutal. Britain had imagined a fertile land that could sustain itself quickly, but reality was harsher. Crops failed, tools broke, and food ran scarce. The convicts, many of whom had little agricultural experience, struggled to adapt to the land. Rations were cut, and starvation loomed. Governor Phillip worked tirelessly to keep order. He distributed land, oversaw the building of shelters, and enforced discipline. Yet even with careful management, survival hung by a thread. The colony depended on supply ships from Britain, which often arrived late or not at all. When the Sirius, one of the colony's main supply ships, was wrecked in 1790, desperation deepened. Convicts endured harsh punishment for disobedience or attempted escape. Yet they were also the workforce upon which the colony depended. Many were eventually granted land, beginning the transformation from prisoners to settlers. For them, exile was both punishment and, unexpectedly, opportunity. Aboriginal resistance and disruption. For the Aboriginal peoples of the Sydney region, the arrival of the First Fleet was catastrophic. To them, this was not an empty land, but a living homeland with deep spiritual ties. The sudden presence of armed strangers, the felling of trees, and the spread of livestock were shocking intrusions. Early contact was marked by a fragile balance of curiosity and tension. Governor Phillip attempted to foster peaceful relations, even ordering that Aboriginal people not be harmed. But cultural misunderstandings, competition for resources, and acts of violence quickly eroded trust. Smallpox, likely brought by Europeans, ravaged Aboriginal communities, killing thousands and weakening resistance. Yet resistance did occur. Warriors like Pemulwuy of the Bidjigal people waged guerrilla campaigns against settlers, raiding farms and challenging the colonial presence. These early conflicts marked the beginning of the Frontier Wars, a struggle that would stretch across the continent for more than a century. Expansion and growth. Despite the hardships, the colony began to grow. By the 1790s, new governors expanded settlements, introduced new crops, and improved farming techniques. Convicts who completed their sentences were granted land, forming a class of emancipated settlers. The economy slowly took shape, built on agriculture, timber, and the forced labor of convicts. In 1804, the colony faced its first major convict rebellion, the Castle Hill Uprising, sometimes called the Battle of Vinegar Hill. Irish convicts, many transported for political crimes, rose up against British authority. The rebellion was swiftly crushed, but it revealed the simmering tensions within the penal system, the founding of other colonies. As Sydney grew, other settlements began to appear. In 1803, a penal colony was established in Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. Its remote location and harsh conditions made it a place of fear for convicts, but it also became a hub of agriculture and whaling, expanding the reach of British settlement. Each new colony meant further displacement for Aboriginal peoples. Frontier conflict spread as traditional lands were fenced, cleared, and claimed. The balance that had sustained Aboriginal societies for tens of thousands of years was shattered within decades. Legacy of the First Fleet. The First Fleet was more than a beginning of British Australia. It was the collision of two worlds, one ancient and enduring, the other modern and expansionist. It set in motion themes that would define Australian history: survival against harsh odds, the tension between authority and rebellion, and the deep scars left by colonization. For the convicts, it was exile turned into new lives. For the Marines and officers, it was duty and ambition. For the Aboriginal peoples, it was the beginning of dispossession, disease, and resistance. By the early 19th century, the colony had survived its birth pangs. It was no longer just a penal outpost, but a growing settlement with farms, trade, and the beginnings of a new society. And yet, the most transformative chapters were still to come. In Section 4, we'll explore the age of expansion and prosperity, the growth of free settlers, and the rising conflicts of land, labour, and identity that would shape colonial Australia. By the early 19th century, Australia was no longer just a precarious penal settlement clinging to survival. The colony of New South Wales had begun to grow in confidence. Farms expanded beyond the boundaries of Sydney, new settlements were founded, and the rhythms of colonial life began to take shape. Yet with expansion came prosperity for some, hardship for many, and devastating consequences for the first peoples who had called this land home for millennia: free settlers and land hunger. At first, Australia had been envisioned mainly as a prison at the far end of the world. But by the 1820s, change was underway. More free settlers began to arrive, men and women not bound by convict chains, but drawn by the promise of land, opportunity, and wealth. The colonial administration encouraged this shift. Land grants were offered to those willing to farm. Wool production, fueled by the introduction of merino sheep, quickly became the backbone of the economy. By the mid-19th century, Australian wool was supplying Britain's industrial looms, weaving the continent into the fabric of the global economy. Convicts remained the colony's workforce, but emancipated convicts, emancipists, began carving out their own futures as landholders, traders, and artisans, and a distinct social hierarchy developed, divided between the powerful free settlers, the struggling convicts, and the Aboriginal peoples whose lands were being steadily dispossessed. The push. Beyond the Blue Mountains. For years, the Blue Mountains west of Sydney were seen as an impenetrable barrier. Rugged cliffs and deep valleys kept the colony confined to the coastal strip. But in 1813, explorers Gregory Blaxland, William Lawson, and William Charles Wentworth found a route across. Their journey opened the vast inland plains to European eyes, land rich for grazing and expansion. Almost immediately, settlers poured through, bringing sheep and cattle into Aboriginal territories. Towns like Bathurst sprang up, becoming frontiers of colonial expansion. But every new farm, every new fence, meant conflict. The frontier wars. The so-called frontier was not an empty wilderness, but living country, managed and inhabited by Aboriginal nations for tens of thousands of years. As settlers advanced, resistance grew. From the Hawkesbury to the Hunter Valley, from Tasmania to the Darling Downs, Aboriginal warriors launched raids, ambushes, and campaigns of resistance. Leaders like Pemulwuy in New South Wales, Yargan in Western Australia, and Tarranorera in Tasmania became symbols of defiance. They fought to protect their people, their land, and their way of life. But they faced a relentless enemy: muskets, disease, and a colonial government that increasingly sanctioned violence. The conflicts that followed, often called the Frontier Wars, stretched across more than a century. They were not a single war, but countless local struggles, skirmishes, raids, massacres. Settlers feared Aboriginal reprisals. Aboriginal peoples endured systematic displacement and slaughter. The violence was often hidden, unrecorded or downplayed, but its scars run deep in Australia's history. Van Diemen's Land and the Black War nowhere was the violence more intense than in Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. In the early 19th century, the arrival of settlers led to a series of conflicts known as the Black War. Armed clashes, reprisals, and massacres devastated Aboriginal communities. Colonial authorities even organized military-style operations, driving Aboriginal peoples from their lands. By the 1830s, the Aboriginal population of Tasmania had been reduced to a fraction of its original size. Survivors were forced into missions and settlements, cut off from their traditional ways of life. It was one of the darkest chapters of colonization, a stark reminder that Australia's prosperity came at a terrible human cost. Prosperity for the few. While Aboriginal peoples endured dispossession, some colonists prospered. The wool boom created vast fortunes for wealthy squatters who controlled enormous runs of land. These pastoralists became the colony's new elite, influencing politics and society. For convicts, conditions remained harsh. Many labored on farms, roads, and public works under strict discipline. Yet over time, more gained freedom and opportunities. By the 1830s and 40s, transportation of convicts was increasingly criticized, both by colonists, who resented the stain of the penal origins, and by reformers in Britain. Gradually, the system began to wind down, and in 1840, convict transportation to New South Wales officially ended. Cultural life and emerging identity. As the colonies matured, a cultural identity began to take shape. Newspapers were founded, theatres opened, and schools were established. The seeds of Australian literature and art appeared, often reflecting the harsh beauty of the land and the struggles of its people. But it was not yet a nation. Australia remained a patchwork of separate colonies: New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, Western Australia, and later South Australia, each with its own government and economy. Rivalries simmered, but so too did the idea of shared destiny. A colony transformed by the mid-19th century, Australia was changing rapidly. No longer just a dumping ground for convicts, it was a land of opportunity for free settlers, a source of immense wealth for Britain, and a society with its own tensions, ambitions, and contradictions. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity lay unresolved truths: that the land had been taken, that Aboriginal resistance continued, and that the young colonies were still searching for their place in the world. And soon, a new force would transform everything again. Gold. In Section 5, we will enter the age of the gold rush, a time of fortune, migration, rebellion, and the forging of the multicultural Australia that was just beginning to emerge. It began with a glint in the ground, a glimmer of wealth that promised to transform lives. In the mid-19th century, the discovery of gold turned Australia from a remote penal colony into a magnet for fortune seekers from across the globe. With it came riches, chaos, rebellion, and the birth of a society that was more diverse, more ambitious, and more complex than ever before. The first discoveries. Although gold had been found in small quantities earlier, the first major discovery came in 1851 near Bathurst in New South Wales. Almost simultaneously, larger finds were reported in Victoria, around Ballarat and Bendigo. News spread like wildfire. Overnight, Australia became the new El Dorado. Farmers, shopkeepers, and labourers abandoned their jobs and rushed to the diggings. Ships arriving in Sydney and Melbourne were suddenly empty of crews, their sailors deserting to try their luck in the goldfields. What began as a trickle quickly swelled into a flood. A land of fortune seekers. The gold rush brought an extraordinary influx of people. From Britain, Ireland, and Europe, migrants came in the tens of thousands, but the rush also drew people from much farther afield. Chinese miners, in particular, arrived in large numbers, bringing unique methods of working the goldfields. Americans, too, came, many veterans of California's own gold rush. By the mid-1850s, Australia's population had more than doubled. This sudden diversity reshaped colonial society. Melbourne, a modest settlement only a decade earlier, exploded into a bustling metropolis. Wealth from gold built grand public buildings, banks, and theatres. Australia, once seen as a distant prison island, was now one of the wealthiest places on Earth. Life on the goldfields. But life on the goldfields was not easy. Digging for gold meant long hours of back-breaking work, sifting through mud and rock under harsh conditions. Few struck it rich. For many, the dream of instant wealth ended in exhaustion and disappointment. The goldfields were crowded, muddy, and often lawless. Tents sprawled across hillsides, streets were carved from dust and rain, and makeshift stores and saloons sprang up overnight. Disease, crime, and conflict were common companions. Yet amid the chaos, a vibrant, rough-edged community life developed, a place where songs were sung, stories were told, and people from across the world mingled in ways unseen before in Australia. Tensions and rebellion. The government, eager to control and profit from the gold boom, imposed harsh licensing fees on miners. Every man, whether successful or not, had to pay for the right to dig. These fees were deeply resented. Miners saw them as unfair, oppressive, and symbolic of a government that cared only for revenue, not justice. Resentment reached a breaking point in December 1854 at Ballarat in Victoria. There, miners raised a flag of defiance, the Southern Cross, and built a stockade. They demanded fairer conditions, representation, and an end to exploitation. The rebellion, known as the Eureka Stockade, was short-lived. Government troops stormed the barricade, killing dozens of miners. But the legacy of Eureka was profound. Though crushed, it became a symbol of resistance, democracy, and the right to a fair go, values that would echo through Australian history. For many, it marked the first sparks of a distinctly Australian political consciousness. The Chinese experience among the most significant groups in the gold rush were Chinese miners. By the 1850s, thousands had arrived, often working in organized groups and using efficient techniques to extract gold from areas abandoned by others. Their presence, however, sparked resentment and racism among European miners. The Chinese were seen as outsiders, their customs and appearance targets of hostility. Violence and discriminatory laws followed, restricting their movement and imposing special taxes. Yet despite prejudice, Chinese communities endured, leaving lasting cultural and economic contributions. Their story marked both the beginnings of Australia's multicultural fabric and the darker history of exclusion and racism. Wealth and transformation. The wealth of the gold rush extended far beyond the diggings. It fueled infrastructure, built railways, funded newspapers, and expanded cities. Melbourne, in particular, became known as Marvellous Melbourne, one of the richest cities in the world during the 1880s. The influx of people also accelerated calls for political reform. Colonial governments, pressured by their diverse and growing populations, moved toward broader representation, land reform, and greater autonomy. Aboriginal peoples and the gold rush. For Aboriginal peoples, the gold rush brought further dispossession. Miners flooded into their lands, disrupting hunting grounds, polluting waterways, and bringing violence. Some Aboriginal men and women found work on the gold fields as guides, labourers, or traders, but many more were pushed aside by the relentless tide of settlement. The gold rush, like colonization before it, deepened the wounds of displacement, the birth of a new society. By the late 19th century, the gold rush had transformed Australia. It was no longer merely a penal colony or agricultural outpost. It was a land of booming cities, ambitious settlers, and multicultural encounters. The rush brought wealth, but more importantly, it brought people who would shape the nation's future. The spirit of rebellion at Eureka, the diversity of the diggings and the wealth pouring into colonial treasuries, all pointed toward a society that was beginning to imagine itself not just as a cluster of colonies, but as something more. And so Australia moved toward a new era, one of politics, nation-building, and a growing sense of identity. In Section 6, we'll trace the path from booming colonies to federation, how 6 scattered colonies, born of convicts and settlers, came together to form one nation in 1901. By the end of the 19th century, the scattered colonies of Australia were no longer fragile outposts clinging to survival. They had grown into bustling societies with cities, railways, parliaments, and booming economies. Yet they were still divided. 6 colonies, each with its own laws, governments, and ambitions. The question was inevitable: could these separate colonies unite as one nation? The push toward unity. Throughout the 1800s, each colony developed its own identity. New South Wales prided itself as the oldest and most established. Victoria, enriched by gold, saw itself as bold and progressive. Queensland was restless and ambitious, while South Australia prided itself on being a free colony. No convicts, just settlers. Tasmania and Western Australia, more remote, had their own distinct paths. But as populations grew and railways stretched inland, the idea of unity began to stir. Shared concerns, defence, trade, immigration, and the desire for a stronger voice in world affairs created momentum for federation. Nationalist newspapers and politicians spoke of Australia for the Australians, appealing to a sense of shared destiny that was beginning to overshadow colonial rivalries. The drafting of a constitution. The movement toward federation gathered steam in the 1890s. Conventions were held, debates were fierce, and delegates from across the colonies wrestled with how to unite without losing their autonomy. The solution was a federal system, inspired by models like the United States and Canada, where power would be divided between a central government and the states. The Australian Constitution was drafted with care, balancing state rights with national unity. It was, however, a product of its time. It enshrined British-style institutions, loyalty to the Crown, and, significantly, it excluded Aboriginal peoples from being counted in the census or fully recognised as citizens. Women, too, were initially left outside the national framework, though their voices were growing stronger. Federation achieved. On January 1, 1901, the dream of federation became reality. The 6 colonies officially united to form the Commonwealth of Australia. Ceremonies were held in Sydney and Melbourne with parades, speeches, and great optimism. A new nation had been born, still tied to Britain, but with its own federal parliament, constitution, and identity. Edmund Barton became the first Prime Minister, while the first federal parliament was opened in Melbourne. Canberra, the purpose-built capital, would not be chosen until years later. Nationhood and identity federation was a landmark moment, but it was also a cautious one. Australia was born as a dominion of the British Empire, with strong ties to London in politics, trade, and defence. Its flag carried the Union Jack, and Australians still considered themselves loyal subjects of the Crown. Yet beneath this loyalty, a distinct Australian character was emerging, one shaped by the harshness of the land, the spirit of the bush, and the ideal of the fair go, the White Australia policy. Alongside federation came one of the most controversial policies in the nation's history, the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, known as the White Australia Policy. Fearful of Chinese, Pacific Islander, and other non-European migrants, the new Parliament sought to preserve Australia as a society of British heritage. This policy reflected the racial attitudes of the era, but it also revealed anxieties about national identity. Who was considered Australian? For decades, immigration laws would enforce exclusion, shaping Australia's population and limiting its diversity. It would take much of the 20th century to dismantle this policy and embrace multiculturalism, women, and democracy. Despite these restrictions, Australia was ahead of many nations in granting women political rights. In 1902, just 1 year after federation, women won the right to vote in federal elections and to stand for parliament. This made Australia one of the world's pioneers in women's suffrage, a milestone that shaped its democratic tradition. Aboriginal exclusion. For Aboriginal peoples, however, federation was a moment of silence and exclusion. The new constitution deliberately ignored them, excluding them from the census and leaving their welfare to the states. To the new nation, they were invisible, a stark contrast to their deep presence in the land's history. This exclusion would fuel generations of struggle as Aboriginal Australians fought for recognition, rights, and justice. Federation, for them, marked not a birth of nationhood, but the entrenchment of marginalisation. A nation tested abroad. Australia's sense of nationhood was quickly tested on the world stage. Only 13 years after federation, The outbreak of World War I would call Australians to fight far from home. At Gallipoli in 1915, Australian soldiers forged a legend, the Anzac spirit, one of courage, mateship, and sacrifice. Though a tragic defeat, Gallipoli became a cornerstone of national identity, binding Australians together in pride and grief. This was the paradox of early federation, a nation asserting its identity, yet still proving itself through loyalty to the British Empire. A new century, a new journey. By the early 20th century, Australia was a young nation, brimming with confidence, but also carrying the burdens of exclusion and inequality. Its cities flourished, its parliaments debated, and its people began to see themselves as Australians first, colonists second. The road to federation had been long, and the journey ahead would be even more challenging. In Section 7, we'll explore how Australia navigated the storms of the 20th century, world wars, economic depression, and the gradual shift from colony to independent nation. The dawn of the 20th century saw Australia as a newly federated nation, young, proud, but still tied firmly to the British Empire. Over the next decades, it would be tested by global conflict, economic hardship, and the long struggle to define its place in the world. The 20th century was the crucible in which modern Australia was forged, the First World War and the Anzac legend. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1914, Australia followed automatically. Tens of thousands of young Australians volunteered, many seeing it as their duty to serve the empire. For a nation only 13 years old, it was also a chance to prove itself on the world stage. In 1915, Australian and New Zealand troops landed at Gallipoli in Turkey. The campaign was brutal, poorly planned, and ultimately a failure. Thousands died in trenches and on ridges, yet from this tragedy emerged the Anzac legend, a story of courage, mateship, and endurance in the face of impossible odds. Anzac Day, first commemorated in 1916, became a sacred national day of remembrance. It symbolized not just loss but identity. Australians saw themselves as tough, loyal, and willing to sacrifice. World War I left 60,000 Australians dead and many more wounded, a staggering toll for a small population. The war scarred communities but also bound the nation together. The interwar years and the Great Depression. After the war, Australia sought to rebuild. The 1920s brought some prosperity, but the Great Depression of the 1930s hit hard. Unemployment soared, families went hungry, and shanty towns sprang up on city fringes. The Depression exposed deep inequalities, but it also fueled political change. Trade unions gained strength, social welfare programs began to take root, and the idea of government responsibility for citizens' well-being grew. The hardships of the era left a lasting imprint on Australian politics and society. The Second World War and a turning point. When World War II broke out in 1939, Australia once again followed Britain into conflict. But this time, the threat was far closer to home. With the fall of Singapore in 1942 and Japanese attacks on Darwin and Sydney, Australians realised that Britain could no longer guarantee their security. In response, Prime Minister John Curtin made a bold pivot. He looked to the United States for support. American troops poured into Australia, and General Douglas MacArthur made his headquarters in Melbourne. The alliance with the US marked a turning point, reshaping Australia's foreign policy for generations to come. Australian forces fought in North Africa, the Pacific, and Europe. At home, the war accelerated industrialization, brought women into the workforce in new roles, and highlighted the need for greater national self-reliance. By the war's end, Australia had emerged more confident, more modern, and less dependent on Britain. Post-war migration and multiculturalism. The aftermath of World War II also brought a dramatic demographic shift. Determined to boost population for security and economic growth, Australia launched a massive immigration program. Millions of migrants arrived from Britain, Italy, Greece, and later from Eastern Europe. By the 1970s, migrants from Asia, the Middle East, and beyond were transforming Australian society. The old White Australia policy was gradually dismantled, and multiculturalism became an official policy. Food, culture, language, and identity expanded in richness and diversity. Australia was no longer just British at the edge of Asia. It was becoming something new, a multicultural nation. Aboriginal struggles and rights. For Aboriginal Australians, the 20th century was a time of dispossession but also of awakening resistance. The Constitution of 1901 had excluded them, but by the 1930s, Aboriginal activists were organising, demanding rights and recognition. The 1967 referendum was a turning point. More than 90% of Australians voted to amend the Constitution, finally allowing Aboriginal people to be counted in the census and enabling the federal government to legislate for their benefit. It was a symbolic step toward equality, though much remained unresolved. Land rights became a major struggle. In 1992, the High Court Mabo decision overturned the legal fiction of terra nullius, the idea that Australia had been empty at colonization. This recognition of native title was a watershed moment, though reconciliation remains an ongoing national challenge. Breaking away from Britain. Through much of the 20th century, Australia wrestled with its ties to Britain. Legally, Britain retained influence long after Federation, but gradually Australia asserted independence. The Statute of Westminster in 1931, formally adopted in 1942, gave Australia control over its own foreign policy. The Australia Act of 1986 finally ended most remaining legal ties, making Australia fully sovereign. The question of the monarchy remained divisive. In 1999, Australians voted in a referendum on whether to become a republic and remove the British monarch as head of state. The proposal failed, but the debate continues. The emergence of a modern nation. By the end of the 20th century, Australia had transformed. Once a penal colony, it was now a prosperous democracy with strong institutions, a diverse population, and a unique voice in world affairs. Its culture blended Indigenous heritage, British traditions, and the influences of migrants from every corner of the globe. Yet tensions remained. Questions of reconciliation, identity, and independence lingered. Was Australia still a British outpost or an Asian-Pacific nation? Could it reconcile its history of colonization with the richness of Aboriginal culture? These were questions the 21st century would inherit, and so we arrive at the final chapter. In Section 8, we'll explore Australia in the modern era, how it has faced the challenges of globalization, environmental crisis, and identity in the 21st century, and how its story continues to unfold. Australia today is a nation of contrasts. It is a land of ancient traditions and cutting-edge modernity, of vast deserts and bustling cities, of Indigenous voices and immigrant dreams. Its history has shaped it into one of the most unique societies on Earth, resilient, diverse, and ever-evolving. Yet the legacy of its past continues to echo through every debate about identity, environment, and place in the world. A vibrant, multicultural society. By the early 21st century, Australia had become one of the most successful multicultural nations in the world. Migrants from Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa reshaped its cities, cuisines, and culture. Sydney and Melbourne emerged as global hubs, celebrated for their diversity and vibrancy. The dismantling of the White Australia policy in the 1970s and 80s allowed immigration to flourish from Asia, particularly from countries such as China, Vietnam, and India. This transformed Australia's cultural landscape, moving it beyond its earlier British-centric identity. Festivals, food, language, and traditions now reflect a tapestry of cultures, making Australia a true crossroads of the Pacific. Aboriginal recognition and reconciliation. At the same time, the struggle for Aboriginal recognition has become central to Australia's story. The Mabo decision in 1992 and the Native Title Act that followed acknowledged Indigenous land rights. The 2008 National Apology to the Stolen Generations by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd marked another milestone, recognizing the injustices inflicted upon Aboriginal children who had been forcibly removed from their families. Yet reconciliation remains incomplete. Aboriginal Australians continue to face disparities in health, education, and opportunity. The movement for constitutional recognition and a voice to Parliament reflects the ongoing call for justice and inclusion. The persistence of Aboriginal culture, its art, music, languages, and spiritual connection to country ensures that Australia's identity is rooted not just in colonial history, but in the world's oldest continuous culture. Politics and identity in the modern era. Australia in the 21st century has also grappled with questions of national identity. The Republican debate, simmering since the failed referendum of 1999, still lingers. Should Australia cut its final symbolic ties to the British monarchy and become a republic? The question remains unresolved, a reminder of the nation's dual inheritance, British institutions and an independent spirit. Domestically, politics has often been marked by sharp divisions over climate policy, immigration, and economic reform. Yet Australian democracy, robust and inclusive, remains one of the strongest in the world. Compulsory voting ensures high participation, and the fair go ethos continues to underpin debates over justice and equality. Environmental challenges. No story of modern Australia is complete without addressing the environment. The continent's fragile ecosystems face immense pressure from climate change, droughts, bushfires, and coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. The catastrophic fires of 2019-2020, known as the Black Summer, burned millions of hectares, destroyed communities, and killed or displaced nearly 3 billion animals. These challenges have made environmental policy a defining issue of Australian politics. They have also highlighted the importance of Aboriginal land management practices, such as traditional fire stick farming, which offer sustainable ways of caring for the land. In confronting environmental crises, Australia finds itself drawing on both modern science and ancient wisdom. Australia on the global stage. Internationally, Australia has carved out a role as a middle power, active in diplomacy, trade, and security. Its alliance with the United States, forged during World War II, remains central to defense strategy, but its geographic position ties it closely to Asia. Relations with China, its largest trading partner, reflect both opportunity and tension, balancing economic dependence with concerns over influence and sovereignty. Australia has also played key roles in peacekeeping missions, climate negotiations, and humanitarian aid. Its athletes, artists, and scientists continue to make their mark globally, while its lifestyle, from surfing beaches to cafe culture, has become iconic. Culture, sport, and global identity sport remains a pillar of Australian identity. Cricket, rugby, Australian rules, football, and the Olympics showcase the nation's passion and competitive spirit. The triumphs of athletes like Cathy Freeman, who carried both the Aboriginal and Australian flags in 2000, symbolise the fusion of ancient and modern identities. Australian culture too has flourished on the world stage, from the films of directors like Baz Luhrmann to global music stars to Indigenous art displayed in leading galleries. Australia exports more than raw materials. It shares stories, creativity, and perspectives. Looking ahead, modern Australia is both confident and questioning. It has wealth, stability, and influence, yet it wrestles with its history and its future. Can it reconcile with its Indigenous peoples? Can it confront the climate crisis? Can it balance loyalty to old allies with its place in Asia? Its story is unfinished, still being written. What is clear, however, is that Australia today is far more than the sum of its colonial past. It is a land where the world's oldest culture walks alongside new migrants, where deserts and reefs hold secrets of survival and where identity is constantly reimagined. This is modern Australia, a global nation grounded in an ancient land, forever carrying the legacies of its past into the possibilities of its future. From the dawn of deep time to the complexities of the 21st century, the story of Australia is unlike any other. It is a saga written across ancient landscapes, told in the voices of the world's oldest culture, transformed by waves of migration and reshaped by the struggles of survival, conflict, and identity. The journey began with the land itself. A continent drifting in isolation, nurturing creatures found nowhere else on Earth. Into this land came the first peoples, Aboriginal Australians, who for over 60,000 years lived in harmony with its rhythms. Their Dreamtime stories, songlines, and traditions carried knowledge across generations, forging the longest continuous culture on Earth. For millennia, this world was unknown to the rest of humanity until the 17th century brought Dutch and French explorers, and finally James Cook, who claimed the eastern coast for Britain. In 1788, the first fleet arrived, carrying convicts and soldiers to carve out a penal colony. Survival was harsh, relations with Aboriginal peoples fractured, and the seeds of dispossession and resistance were sown. From these fragile beginnings, the colonies expanded. Wool and land fueled prosperity for settlers, while frontier wars scarred the continent. In Tasmania, the Black War devastated Aboriginal communities, yet expansion also brought rebellion and a rough colonial identity, forged in hardship and defiance. The gold rush of the mid-19th century transformed everything. Fortune seekers from across the globe poured into the diggings, creating a multicultural mix of cultures and ideas. The Eureka Stockade Rebellion became a symbol of fairness and democracy, while Chinese migrants endured both contribution and discrimination. Cities boomed, railways spread, and wealth flowed, reshaping society. By 1901, the colonies united in federation, creating the Commonwealth of Australia. A new nation had been born, though it was still bound to Britain and marred by exclusion. The White Australia policy limited diversity, and Aboriginal peoples were written out of the Constitution. Yet the young nation also pioneered women's suffrage and built institutions that would endure. The 20th century tested Australia profoundly. World War I forged the Anzac legend, even as it left deep scars. The Great Depression brought hardship, and World War II forced Australia to look beyond Britain, forging an enduring alliance with the United States. Waves of post-war migration dismantled the old racial order, creating the multicultural society of today. Aboriginal rights movements gained momentum, culminating in the 1967 referendum and landmark land rights cases, though reconciliation remains ongoing. By century's end, Australia had emerged as a prosperous democracy, independent in spirit, multicultural in reality, and still wrestling with its past. In the 21st century, it faces new challenges: climate change, reconciliation, and its role in a shifting global order, but also new opportunities to embrace its unique identity. Australia's history is not a straight line, but a tapestry, woven from the threads of ancient traditions, colonial struggles, migrant dreams, and modern challenges. It is the story of survival and reinvention of a people and a land still learning how to walk together. The story is unfinished, and that is what makes it so powerful.